Troy, a hardworking warehouse employee, always believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. One day, a chance encounter with a disabled veteran in need sets off a chain of events that Troy could never have predicted. When Troy steps away from his job to help the struggling man, his life takes an unexpected turn. He's fired. But what happens next is more shocking than anyone could have imagined, as Troy's simple act of kindness ignites a movement that transforms his life and challenges the very core of the company that let him go. Why did helping a veteran lead to such dramatic consequences? How did Troy's act of compassion uncover hidden truths and spark a wave of change in the community? Stay tuned to find out. And before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if this story of empathy and courage resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The bustling warehouse of Global Shipping Incorporated hummed with activity as workers scurried about, moving packages and operating forklifts. Amidst the organized chaos, one figure stood out: Troy Johnson, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a warm smile that seemed to light up even the dullest corners of the vast space. Troy had been working at Global Shipping for the past 5 years, and in that time, he'd earned a reputation as the go-to guy for just about everything. Need help lifting a particularly heavy box? Troy was there. Struggling to figure out the new inventory system? Troy would patiently walk you through it, step by step. "Hey, Troy," called out Melissa, a petite woman struggling with a stack of boxes that threatened to topple over. "Could you give me a hand?" Without hesitation, Troy jogged over, his work boots thudding against the concrete floor. "I got you, Mel," he said, easily taking half the stack from her arms. "Where are these headed?" "Thanks, Troy," Melissa sighed with relief. "They go to Station 3. I swear, I don't know how you do it. You're always helping everyone out, and you never seem to break a sweat." Troy chuckled as they walked side by side. "It's no big deal. We're all in this together, right? Besides, my mama always said, a little kindness goes a long way." As they reached Station 3, Troy helped Melissa sort the packages. He glanced at his watch, still 10 minutes left on his break. "You good here, Mel? I'm going to grab a quick coffee before the next shift starts." "I'm all set. Thanks to you," Melissa replied with a grateful smile. "You're a lifesaver, Troy. Don't let anyone tell you different." Troy made his way to the break room, exchanging friendly nods and waves with his coworkers. He'd just poured himself a cup of coffee when he heard a sharp voice behind him. "Johnson, there you are." Troy turned to see Mr. Carlson, the warehouse supervisor, standing in the doorway. Mr. Carlson was a thin, wiry man with a perpetual frown etched on his face. His steel-gray eyes seemed to constantly scan the warehouse floor, looking for any sign of inefficiency. "Good morning, Mr. Carlson," Troy said politely. "Is there something I can help you with?" Mr. Carlson's frown deepened. "I saw you helping Melissa earlier. That's the 3rd time this week I've caught you assisting other workers during your designated tasks." Troy blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't understand. I finished my assigned work for the morning, and Melissa needed help. I thought dash." "You're not paid to think, Johnson," Mr. Carlson cut him off. "You're paid to do your job. If you have extra time, you should be asking for more work, not gallivanting around helping others." Troy felt a flicker of frustration, but he kept his voice calm. "Mr. Carlson, with all due respect, I believe helping my co-workers is part of my job. It improves overall efficiency and morale." Mr. Carlson's eyes narrowed. "Efficiency is measured in numbers, Johnson. Quotas. Shipments processed, not in how many times you play hero to your co-workers." He jabbed a finger at Troy's chest. "Remember, you're here to work, not to make friends. Keep that in mind, or you might find yourself looking for a new job." "Understood." Troy wanted to argue, to explain that there was more to work than just numbers, but he knew it would fall on deaf ears. "Yes, sir," he said instead, his jaw tight. Mr. Carlson nodded curtly and left, leaving Troy alone with his cooling coffee and a bitter taste in his mouth that had nothing to do with the drink. As Troy made his way back to his station, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. He'd always believed that work was about more than just meeting quotas. It was about being part of a team, supporting each other, and finding fulfillment in what you do. Mr. Carlson's words felt like a bucket of cold water on that belief. "Don't let him get to you, Troy," said a voice to his left. Troy turned to see Eddie, one of the older workers, giving him a sympathetic look. Carlson's been riding everyone hard lately. Word is upper management's breathing down his neck about productivity. Troy sighed. I get that we need to meet our targets, Eddie. But at what cost? We're not robots. A little humanity goes a long way in keeping people motivated. Eddie nodded. Preaching to the choir, my friend. Just watch your back, okay? Carlson's been looking for reasons to crack down, and I'd hate to see you in his crosshairs. Troy appreciated Eddie's concern, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong with this situation. He was about to respond when a commotion near the warehouse entrance caught his attention. A man in his late 30s was struggling to maneuver through the door, a stack of boxes balanced precariously in his arms. What caught Troy's eye was the man's right leg, or rather, the absence of it. In its place was a prosthetic limb, visible beneath the hem of his shorts. Without thinking, Troy rushed over to help. "Sir, let me get that for you," he said, relieving the man of his burden. The man looked up, surprise and gratitude mingling on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "I thought I could manage, but I guess I bit off more than I could chew this time." Troy smiled. "Happy to help. I'm Troy. Are you here to pick up or drop off?" "Pick up," the man replied, extending his hand. "James Connor. I live just down the street, so I usually come by to get my packages myself. Saves on delivery fees, you know?" As they shook hands, Troy couldn't help but notice the calluses and strength in James' grip. This was a man who was used to hard work, despite his disability. "Nice to meet you, James," Troy said. "Let's get you sorted out. Where are these headed?" James grinned. "Just to my car in the parking lot. I'd appreciate the help if you can spare a minute." Troy glanced around, making sure Mr. Carlson wasn't in sight. "Of course," he said. "Lead the way." As they walked to James' car, Troy couldn't help but ask, "If you don't mind me saying, sir, you seem pretty familiar with the layout here. You come by often?" James nodded. "At least once a week. I run a small online business selling military memorabilia. Keeps me busy, you know." He tapped his prosthetic leg. "After this happened, I had to find new ways to keep myself useful." Troy's respect for the man grew. "That's impressive, sir. If you don't mind me asking, were you in the military?" A shadow passed over James' face. "Marines. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Lost a leg to an IED on my 2nd tour." He shook his head, as if shaking off the memories. "But that's all in the past now. These days, I'm just trying to make a living like everyone else." They reached James' car, an older model sedan that had seen better days. Troy carefully loaded the boxes into the trunk while James leaned against the car, catching his breath. "You know," James said, watching Troy work, "most people see the leg and either avoid me or treat me like I'm made of glass. It's refreshing to meet someone who just treats me like a regular guy." Troy straightened up. "That's because you're a regular guy, James. One who's been through more than most, sure, but still just a man trying to make his way in the world. We all deserve respect, regardless of our circumstances." James' eyes crinkled with a smile. "You're all right, Troy. Don't let this place change that about you." He glanced at the warehouse. Troy nodded approvingly. "How long have you been running this business?" As they worked together to load the remaining boxes, James opened up about his life. "Started about 3 years ago, not long after I got back from my last tour. It was tough at first, you know, coming back home, missing a leg, feeling like I didn't fit in anywhere." Troy listened intently, sensing that James didn't often get the chance to share his story. "I can't even imagine what that must have been like," he said softly. James leaned against the car, his eyes distant. "It's a hell of a thing, Troy. One minute you're on patrol with your unit, guys you trust with your life. The next, you're waking up in a hospital bed, part of you gone forever." He shook his head. The physical pain was bad enough, but the mental toll, that was something else entirely. Troy paused in his work, giving James his full attention. "How did you cope with it all?" A small smile played on James' lips. "Honestly, it was rough for a while. Fell into some bad habits, pushed away the people who cared about me. But then I met this counselor at the VA. Sarah, her name was. She helped me see that my life wasn't over, just changed. Got me into therapy, both physical and mental. That must have taken a lot of strength," Troy said, admiration clear in his voice. James nodded. "It did. But you know what really turned things around? finding a purpose again. That's where the business came in. I've always been a bit of a history buff, especially when it comes to military stuff. Sarah suggested I turn that passion into something productive. As they finished loading the last of the boxes, Troy couldn't help but be impressed by James' resilience. And now look at you, running a successful business, staying active. You're an inspiration, James. James waved off the compliment, but Troy could see the appreciation in his eyes. I'm just trying to make the best of what I've got. But let me tell you, it's not always easy. Some days, the phantom pains are so bad, I can barely get out of bed. And don't even get me started on the nightmares. Troy's brow furrowed with concern. Is there anything that helps with that? Time helps, James replied. And staying busy. That's another reason why I like coming here to pick up my packages myself. Even on days when it's a struggle. Keeps me active, you know? Plus, I get to meet good people like you. Troy smiled, touched by James' words. He glanced at his watch and realized with a start that he'd been talking with James for nearly 20 minutes. But looking at James, seeing the gratitude and newfound ease in his posture, Troy couldn't bring himself to regret it. Listen, James, Troy said, I know it's not much, but if you ever need a hand with your deliveries or anything else, don't hesitate to ask. I'm usually around, and I'm happy to help. James' eyes widened slightly, clearly touched by the offer. I appreciate that more than you know, Troy. It's not often people go out of their way like this, especially for someone they barely know. Troy shrugged, a warm smile on his face. Like I said, that's what friends are for. And I'd like to think we're becoming friends. James extended his hand, and Troy clasped it firmly. I'd like that too, Troy. You're a good man. As they shook hands, Troy felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond anything he'd experienced in his job. Here was a man who had sacrificed so much for his country, now fighting a different kind of battle every day. If Troy could make that battle a little easier, even in small ways, it felt like the least he could do. Well, I should probably head back, Troy said, reluctantly breaking the moment. But seriously, James, don't be a stranger. If you need anything, just ask for me at the front desk. James nodded, a genuine smile lighting up his face. Will do, Troy. And thanks again. You've made today a whole lot brighter. As James got into his car, Troy couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Despite Mr. Carlson's warnings, he knew in his heart that he'd done the right thing. Helping others, whether they were co-workers or customers, was part of what made work meaningful. However, Troy's good mood was about to be severely tested. As he approached the warehouse entrance, he saw a familiar figure standing there, arms crossed and a thunderous expression on his face. Mr. Carlson, the warehouse supervisor, looked like he was about to burst a blood vessel. Johnson, Mr. Carlson barked as soon as Troy was within earshot. Where the hell have you been? Your break ended 20 minutes ago. Troy took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation. I'm sorry, Mr. Carlson. I was helping a customer with some heavy packages. He's a disabled veteran, and dash. I don't care if he's the Queen of England. Mr. Carlson cut him off, his face reddening. Your job is in here, not out there playing Good Samaritan. Do you have any idea how far behind we are now because of your little field trip? Troy felt a flicker of anger, but he fought to keep his voice calm and respectful. Sir, I understand your concern, but I believe helping our customers is part of our job. Mr. Connor needed assistance, and I was in a position to provide it. Mr. Carlson's eyes narrowed dangerously. Let me make something very clear to you, Johnson. Your job is to move packages inside this warehouse. Period. Customer service is not in your job description. We have people for that, and you're not one of them. But sir, Troy protested, surely we should all be concerned with customer satisfaction. Mr. Connor is a regular client, and dash. Enough! Mr. Carlson snapped, cutting Troy off mid-sentence. I don't want to hear any more excuses. You're here to work, not to make friends or play hero. This is your final warning, Johnson. One more stunt like this, and you'll be looking for a new job. Is that clear? Troy wanted to argue further, to make Mr. Carlson understand the importance of what he'd done. But he could see it would be futile. The supervisor's mind was made up, his worldview too narrow to accommodate anything beyond his rigid interpretation of efficiency. Yes, sir, Troy said, his jaw clenched. It won't happen again. Mr. Carlson nodded curtly. See that it doesn't. Now, get back to work. You've got a lot of catching up to do. As Troy walked past Mr. Carlson into the warehouse, he could feel the supervisor's eyes boring into his back. The sense of fulfillment he'd felt just moments ago with James had been replaced by a heavy weight in his stomach. He knew he'd done the right thing, but in Mr. Carlson's eyes, that didn't matter. Inside, Troy's co-workers shot him sympathetic glances. Word of his confrontation with Mr. Carlson had clearly spread quickly. As he made his way to his station, Melissa sidled up to him. "You okay, Troy?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. We could hear Carlson yelling from inside. "What happened?" Troy sighed, running a hand over his face. "I was helping a disabled vet that comes here regularly, James. Lost track of time." Carlson wasn't too happy about it. Melissa shook her head. "That man has ice water in his veins, I swear. Don't let him get to you, Troy. We all know you were just doing what comes naturally to you, being a decent human being." Troy managed a small smile. "Thanks, Mel. I appreciate that. But be careful, okay?" Melissa replied. Troy nodded, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. "I hear you. I'll watch my step." As Melissa returned to her station, Troy tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to James and their conversation. He thought about the struggles James faced every day, the battles he fought both physically and mentally. And then he thought about Mr. Carlson, so fixated on quotas and efficiency that he couldn't see the human element of their work. As he mechanically sorted packages, Troy wrestled with his conscience. He thought about his family, about the bills that needed paying, and the stability his job provided. But he also thought about the look of gratitude on James' face, about the connection they'd forged over shared stories and mutual respect. As Troy clocked out for the day, he felt a mix of emotions, uncertainty about the future and frustration with Mr. Carlson's narrow-mindedness. As Troy left the warehouse that evening, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. He paused for a moment, looking back at the building where he'd spent so many hours of his life. For the first time, he felt a sense of unease about what the future might hold. The days that followed were challenging for Troy. He did his best to keep his head down and focus solely on his assigned tasks, but it went against every instinct he had. He saw co-workers struggling with heavy loads, but forced himself to look away. He overheard customers asking for assistance, but bit his tongue, remembering Mr. Carlson's warning. Each time, it felt like a small piece of his soul was being chipped away. The warehouse, once a place where Troy had felt fulfilled and purposeful, now seemed cold and impersonal. The camaraderie among the workers had diminished, replaced by a pervasive sense of unease and competition. A week after his confrontation with Mr. Carlson, Troy was sorting packages near the warehouse entrance when a familiar figure caught his eye. James was outside, struggling with a large, unwieldy box. The veteran was using his crutch to try and balance the package while simultaneously attempting to open his car door. Troy froze, his heart racing. He knew he should ignore it, should focus on his work as Mr. Carlson had instructed. But watching James struggle, seeing the frustration and pain on his face, Troy couldn't stand by and do nothing. Taking a deep breath, Troy made his decision. He quickly glanced around, making sure Mr. Carlson wasn't in sight, then hurried out to the parking lot. "James," he called out, "let me give you a hand with that." James looked up, relief washing over his features. "Troy, man, am I glad to see you. This thing's heavier than I expected." Troy took the box from James, easily balancing it in his arms. "No problem. That's what friends are for. Where do you want this?" As Troy helped James load the box into his car, they fell into easy conversation. James told Troy about his latest business ventures, the challenges he'd been facing, and the small victories he'd achieved. Troy listened intently, offering encouragement and support. "You know, Troy," James said as they finished loading the car, "I can't tell you how much I appreciate your help. It's not just the physical assistance, though that's a godsend. It's knowing that there are still people out there who care, who'll go out of their way to help a stranger. It means more than you know." Troy felt a lump form in his throat. This, he thought, this is what Mr. Carlson doesn't understand. This human connection, this ability to make a difference in someone's life, it was worth more than any efficiency metric or quota. "I'm happy to help, James," Troy said, clasping the veteran's shoulder. "Anytime you need anything, you just let me know." As James drove away, Troy felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew he'd made the right choice, regardless of the consequences. He turned to head back into the warehouse, only to find himself face to face with Mr. Carlson. The supervisor's face was a mask of barely contained fury. "Johnson," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "My office. Now." Troy's heart sank, but he held his head high as he followed Mr. Carlson back into the warehouse. He could feel the eyes of his co-workers on him, could sense their concern and sympathy. But he also felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened next, he knew he'd stayed true to his values. In Mr. Carlson's office, the supervisor didn't even bother sitting down. He paced back and forth, like a caged animal, his face red with anger. "What part of one more slip-up and you're out did you not understand, Johnson?" Mr. Carlson snapped. "I warned you. I told you to focus on your job, to stop playing hero. And what do I find? You, once again, wasting company time helping someone who isn't even our customer." Troy stood his ground, meeting Mr. Carlson's gaze steadily. "Sir, with all due respect, James is our customer. He regularly picks up packages from our warehouse. And helping him isn't a waste of time. It's good customer service. It's being a decent human being." Mr. Carlson slammed his hand down on his desk, causing Troy to flinch. "I don't care if he's the Pope himself. Your job is in here, moving packages, meeting quotas. Not out there holding hands with every sob story that comes along." Troy felt a surge of anger at Mr. Carlson's callous words. "James is not a sob story, sir. He's a veteran who sacrificed for this country. He's a businessman trying to make a living despite significant challenges. And yes, sometimes he needs a little help. I don't see how providing that help conflicts with our company's mission or values." Mr. Carlson's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Our company's values? Let me tell you about our company's values, Johnson. Efficiency, productivity, meeting targets. Those are our values. Not coddling every customer who can't handle their own packages." Troy shook his head, disbelief and disappointment washing over him. "If that's truly what this company values, sir, then maybe I don't belong here." A cold smile spread across Mr. Carlson's face. "You're right about that, Johnson. You don't belong here. You're fired. Clear out your locker and be off the premises in the next 30 minutes. Despite having seen it coming, the words still hit Troy like a physical blow. He'd worked at Global Shipping for years, had poured his heart and soul into his job. And now, just like that, it was over. But as the initial shock wore off, Troy felt something else rising within him. A sense of relief, mixed with determination. He'd stood up for what he believed in, had refused to compromise his values. And while it had cost him his job, he knew he'd made the right choice. "Very well, Mr. Carlson," Troy said, his voice steady. "I'll clear out my things. But before I go, I want you to know something. One day, you're going to realize that there's more to running a successful business than just numbers and quotas. It's about people, the customers we serve, the employees who work here. And when that day comes, I hope you remember this moment." With that, Troy turned and walked out of the office, leaving a stunned Mr. Carlson behind. As he made his way to his locker, word of what had happened spread quickly through the warehouse. Co-workers approached him, offering words of support and sympathy. "This isn't right, Troy," Melissa said, tears in her eyes. "You're the best worker we have. How can Carlson not see that?" Troy managed a small smile. "It's okay, Mel. Sometimes standing up for what's right comes with a price. I don't regret helping James or any of the other times I've helped our customers or you guys." As Troy packed up his belongings, he felt a mix of emotions washing over him. There was sadness, of course. This job had been a big part of his life for years. But there was also a sense of pride, of knowing he'd stayed true to his principles even in the face of adversity. Walking out of the warehouse for the last time, Troy paused to look back at the building that had been his second home for so long. He thought about all the friendships he'd formed, all the customers he'd helped, all the small acts of kindness that had made his job meaningful. As he reached his car, Troy's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from James. "Hey, Troy. Just wanted to say thanks again for your help today. You're a real lifesaver. Let me know if there's ever anything I can do for you. Reading the message, Troy felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He may have lost his job, but he'd gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that he'd made a real difference in someone's life. Starting his car, Troy took a deep breath. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to face it with the same compassion and integrity that had guided him so far. As he pulled out of the parking lot, Troy felt a strange mix of uncertainty and hope. This wasn't the end, he realized. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Over the next few days, Troy found himself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. The initial shock of losing his job gave way to a complex mix of anger, fear, and uncertainty. He'd always prided himself on his work ethic and ability to provide for his family. Now, that stability had been yanked out from under him. Telling his family was one of the hardest things Troy had ever done. His wife, Sarah, listened with a mix of concern and support as he recounted what had happened. "Oh, Troy," she said, wrapping her arms around him. "I'm so sorry. But you know what? I'm proud of you. You stood up for what you believe in, for helping others. That's the man I married." Troy felt a lump form in his throat at her words. "Thanks, honey. But what are we going to do now? The bills won't stop coming just because I lost my job." Sarah squeezed his hand. "We'll figure it out together. We always do. You're a skilled worker, Troy. There are other jobs out there, and any company would be lucky to have someone with your work ethic and compassion." Troy Johnson sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of bills and overdue notices. The red ink on some of the envelopes seemed to mock him, a stark reminder of his current predicament. It had been 2 months since Mr. Carlson had fired him from global shipping, and despite his best efforts, Troy was still struggling to find steady employment. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Sarah, his wife, had picked up extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, but it wasn't enough to cover all their expenses. Their savings were dwindling rapidly, and Troy couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that gnawed at him. "It's not your fault, you know," Sarah's voice came from behind him. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Troy. We'll get through this." Troy managed a weak smile, covering her hand with his own. "I know, honey. It's just, I never thought doing the right thing would put us in such a tough spot." Sarah pulled up a chair next to him, her eyes full of concern and love. "Have you heard back from any of the places you applied to?" Troy shook his head. "Nothing yet. I've been to 3 interviews this week, but they all say the same thing. They'll be in touch. I'm starting to think I should be looking for any job, not just warehouse work." "Maybe that's not such a bad idea," Sarah mused. "You've got so many skills, Troy. Maybe this is an opportunity to try something new." Troy nodded, considering her words. He'd been so focused on finding a job similar to what he'd had at Global Shipping that he hadn't really considered other options. "You might be right. I'll expand my search tomorrow." As they sat there, discussing potential job prospects, their doorbell rang. Troy frowned, not expecting any visitors. He opened the door to find Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor, standing there with a concerned look on her face. "Oh, Troy, I'm so glad you're home," she said, wringing her hands. "I hate to bother you, but my sink is leaking something awful, and I can't get a plumber out until tomorrow. I was wondering if you might take a look." Troy's first instinct was to politely decline. He had job applications to fill out, bills to sort through. But looking at Mrs. Henderson's worried face, he couldn't bring himself to say no. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson. Let me grab my toolbox, and I'll be right over." As Troy followed Mrs. Henderson to her house, he felt a familiar sense of purpose wash over him. This was what he'd always loved about his job at Global Shipping, the ability to help others, to make a difference no matter how small. It took Troy about an hour to fix Mrs. Henderson's sink. As he worked, she chatted with him, telling him about her grandchildren and asking about his job search. When he finished, she tried to press some money into his hand. "Oh no, Mrs. Henderson, I couldn't," Troy said, gently refusing. "I'm just happy to help." Mrs. Henderson's eyes welled up with tears. "You're a good man, Troy Johnson. Don't let anyone tell you different. This world needs more people like you." As Troy walked back to his house, he felt a renewed sense of determination. Yes, times were tough, but he hadn't lost the most important thing, his ability to help others, to make a positive impact on his community. Over the next few weeks, as Troy continued his job search, he found himself helping out more and more around the neighborhood. He mowed lawns for those who couldn't manage it themselves, helped carry groceries for elderly neighbors, and even organized a small group to clean up the local park. Each act of kindness, no matter how small, helped keep Troy's spirits up. It reminded him of why he'd stood up to Mr. Carlson in the first place, because he believed in the importance of compassion and community. One afternoon, as Troy was helping the Wilsons, a young couple down the street, move some furniture, he spotted a familiar face walking up the sidewalk. It was James, the disabled veteran he'd helped at Global Shipping. "Troy," James called out, a mix of surprise and concern on his face. "I've been looking all over for you." Troy excused himself from the Wilsons and walked over to James, wiping his brow. "James, what brings you to this neck of the woods?" James' face was serious. "I went by Global Shipping to pick up a package last week. When I asked for you, they told me, 'Troy, why didn't you tell me you'd been fired?'" Troy felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't wanted James to know, hadn't wanted him to feel responsible. "It's not a big deal, James. These things happen." But James wasn't buying it. "Not a big deal? Troy, you lost your job because you were helping me. This is absolutely my fault." Troy shook his head firmly. "No, James. It's not your fault at all. I made the choice to help you, knowing full well what Mr. Carlson's rules were. I'd do it again in a heartbeat." James looked at Troy for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and admiration. "You're something else, you know that? Most people wouldn't have risked their job to help a stranger." Troy shrugged, a little embarrassed by James' praise. "It's not about being special. It's about doing what's right." James nodded slowly, a determined look settling on his face. "Well, now it's my turn to do what's right. Come on, let's grab a coffee. I want to hear everything that's happened, and then we're going to figure out how to fix this." Over coffee at a nearby diner, Troy filled James in on everything that had happened since that day at Global Shipping. He told him about the struggle to find a new job, about the mounting bills, but also about the small acts of kindness he'd been doing around the neighborhood. James listened intently, his face a mix of emotions. When Troy finished, James leaned back in his seat, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, Troy, what happened to you, it's not right. You were punished for being a decent human being, for helping someone in need. That's not the kind of world I fought for." Troy nodded, appreciating James' understanding. "I know, but what can we do about it? What's done is done." A slow smile spread across James' face. "Maybe not. I've got some ideas, but I'm going to need a little help. Do you trust me?" Troy didn't hesitate. "Of course I do, James." "Good," James said, his eyes twinkling with determination, "because we're about to shake things up a bit." Over the next few days, James was a man on a mission. He reached out to his contacts in various veteran support groups, telling them Troy's story. He emphasized not just the injustice of Troy's firing, but the continued kindness and community spirit Troy had shown even in the face of adversity. The response was overwhelming. Veterans from all over the city were moved by Troy's story, seeing in him the kind of compassion and support they often struggled to find in civilian life. One evening, about a week after their coffee shop conversation, James called Troy, excitement evident in his voice. "Troy, you're not going to believe this. Remember that veteran support group I told you about? Well, they want to meet you. Can you come down to the community center tomorrow evening?" Troy agreed, curious about what James had planned. The next evening, he found himself walking into a room full of veterans, all eyes turning to him as he entered. James was there, a broad smile on his face as he introduced Troy to the group. "This is the man I've been telling you about," James said, his voice filled with pride. "Troy Johnson, the guy who risked his job to help a disabled vet he barely knew." Troy felt his face heat up, uncomfortable with the attention. "I didn't do anything special," he protested. "I just did what anyone would do." An older man, his chest adorned with military ribbons, stood up. "Son, what you did was far from ordinary. In a world where too many people look the other way, you chose to help. That's the kind of spirit we need more of." As Troy listened, various members of the group shared their own stories of struggling to reintegrate into civilian life, of feeling forgotten or overlooked. They spoke of how much it meant to them to hear about someone like Troy, someone who went out of his way to help a veteran in need. "We've been talking," James said, addressing Troy directly, "and we've decided we want to do something about what happened to you. We're going to bring awareness to your situation, to show people what real character looks like." Troy felt overwhelmed. "I appreciate that. I really do. But I don't want to cause any trouble. I'm sure Mr. Carlson and Global Shipping were just doing what they thought was best for the company." A murmur of disagreement ran through the room. Another veteran, a woman with short gray hair, spoke up. "That's exactly the problem, Troy. When companies prioritize profits over people, when they punish kindness and compassion, we all lose. Your story needs to be told." As the meeting continued, plans began to take shape. The veterans group decided to launch a social media campaign, sharing Troy's story and calling for companies to value employees who show compassion and go above and beyond for customers. They also planned to reach out to local news stations, hoping to gain wider attention for Troy's situation and the larger issues it represented. Some members even suggested organizing a peaceful protest outside Global Shipping's headquarters. Troy listened to all of this with a mix of gratitude and trepidation. He was touched by the support, but also worried about the potential backlash. "I don't want to cause problems for my former co-workers," he said. "They're good people, just trying to do their jobs." James put a reassuring hand on Troy's shoulder. "We understand that, Troy. This isn't about attacking Global Shipping or the people who work there. It's about highlighting the importance of compassion in the workplace, about showing that there's more to good business than just the bottom line." As the meeting wound down, Troy found himself surrounded by veterans, each wanting to shake his hand or share a word of encouragement. The support was overwhelming, and Troy felt a lump form in his throat. One of the older veterans pulled Troy aside. "Son, I want you to know something. What you did helping James like that, it means more than you can know. For a lot of us, coming back from war, it feels like the world has moved on without us, like we don't matter anymore. But people like you, who take the time to see us, to help us, you remind us that we're still part of this community. Don't ever lose that spirit, you hear?" Troy nodded, too choked up to speak. As he left the community center that night, walking beside James, he felt a mix of emotions. There was gratitude for the support he'd received, hope for what might come from this awareness campaign, but also a lingering worry about the potential consequences. "You okay?" James asked, noticing Troy's thoughtful expression. Troy nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so. It's just, all of this, it's more than I ever expected. I'm not sure I deserve all this support." James stopped walking, turning to face Troy. "Listen to me, Troy. What you did, it wasn't just about helping me load some packages. It was about seeing a fellow human being in need and choosing to help, even at a cost to yourself. That's rare, and it's valuable. The world needs more people like you, and if sharing your story can inspire others to act with the same kindness and compassion, then it's worth doing." Troy considered James' words. He thought about all the small acts of kindness he'd been doing around his neighborhood, about the gratitude he'd seen in people's eyes when he helped them. Maybe James was right. Maybe his story could make a difference. "Okay," Troy said finally, a new resolve in his voice. "Let's do this, but let's make sure we do it right. This isn't about me, or even about what happened at Global Shipping. It's about promoting kindness and compassion in all aspects of life." James grinned, clapping Troy on the shoulder. "Now you're talking. Trust me, Troy, this is just the beginning. We're going to make some waves, and who knows, maybe we'll change a few minds along the way." As they parted ways that night, Troy felt a renewed sense of purpose. He may have lost his job, but he gained something far more valuable: a platform to promote the values he believed in, and a community of supporters who shared his vision of a more compassionate world. Walking home under the starry sky, Troy allowed himself to feel hopeful for the first time in months. Whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. And maybe, just maybe, some good would come out of this whole situation after all. The next morning, Troy woke up to find his phone buzzing with notifications. The veterans group had wasted no time in launching their social media campaign. #StandWithTroy was trending locally, with people sharing stories of times when a small act of kindness had made a big difference in their lives. Sarah sat next to Troy on the couch, scrolling through the posts on her own phone. "This is amazing, Troy," she said, her eyes wide with wonder. "Look at all these people you've inspired." Troy read through the comments, feeling a mix of emotions. There were messages of support, stories from other workers who had faced similar situations, and calls for companies to prioritize compassion in their corporate cultures. But there were also messages that made him uncomfortable. Angry posts calling for boycotts of global shipping, personal attacks on Mr. Carlson. This wasn't what Troy had wanted. He didn't want to destroy the company or hurt his former co-workers. "I need to talk to James," Troy said, standing up. "We need to make sure this doesn't get out of hand." He called James, who agreed to meet him at the local park. When Troy arrived, he found not just James, but several members of the veterans group as well. They were huddled around a laptop, excitedly discussing the campaign's progress. "Troy," James called out, waving him over. "Can you believe the response we're getting? Your story is really resonating with people." Troy sat down, his face serious. "That's great, James, really. But I'm worried about some of the messages I'm seeing. I don't want this to turn into an attack on global shipping or Mr. Carlson." The group fell silent, looking at Troy with surprise. One of the veterans, a man named Mike, spoke up. "But Troy, they wronged you. Don't you want to see them face consequences?" Troy shook his head. "This isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about promoting kindness and compassion, remember? If we respond to what happened with anger and attacks, we're no better than what we're fighting against." James nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. "You're right, Troy. We got caught up in the momentum and lost sight of the real goal. What do you suggest we do?" Troy thought for a moment. "Let's refocus the campaign. Instead of calling out global shipping, let's highlight positive examples of companies and individuals who embody the values of compassion and community service. Let's make this about promoting good, not punishing bad." The group discussed Troy's suggestion, eventually agreeing that it aligned better with their original intentions. They spent the next few hours reshaping their message, sharing stories of companies with strong community engagement and employees who had gone above and beyond to help others. As they worked, a local news van pulled up to the park. A reporter approached the group, microphone in hand. "Are you Troy Johnson?" she asked, looking directly at Troy. "We've been following your story on social media. Would you be willing to give us an interview?" Troy hesitated, looking at James and the others for guidance. James nodded encouragingly. "This is your chance to share your message, Troy. Remember what we talked about. Focus on the positive." Taking a deep breath, Troy agreed to the interview. As the camera rolled, he shared his story, not just of losing his job, but of the kindness he'd experienced from the veterans group and his neighbors. He emphasized the importance of compassion in all aspects of life, including the workplace. "This isn't about one company or one incident," Troy said, looking directly into the camera. "It's about the kind of society we want to live in, one where we look out for each other, where we value kindness as much as we value productivity. I lost my job for helping someone, but I gained a community and a purpose. And if my story can inspire others to act with compassion, then it's all been worth it." As the interview concluded, Troy felt a sense of peace wash over him. He'd stayed true to his values, promoting positivity even in the face of adversity. Whatever came next, he knew he'd done the right thing. Little did Troy know that his words were about to reach far beyond his local community, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge not just global shipping, but the very nature of corporate culture in their city and beyond. The days following Troy's television interview were a whirlwind of activity. His story, once confined to local social media, had now spread across the nation. Hashtag #StandWithTroy became more than just a trending hashtag. It evolved into a movement, sparking conversations about compassion in the workplace and the true meaning of corporate responsibility. Troy found himself at the center of a media storm. Requests for interviews poured in from national news networks, talk shows, and even a few documentary filmmakers. It was overwhelming, to say the least. "I don't know about this, Sarah," Troy said one evening, staring at the pile of business cards and interview requests on their kitchen table. "This is getting bigger than I ever imagined. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make things worse?" Sarah wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "Troy, honey, you've never said the wrong thing when it comes to kindness and compassion. That's who you are. Just keep being yourself, and you'll be fine." Troy nodded, drawing strength from his wife's unwavering support. You're right. I never wanted to be in the spotlight like this. I was just trying to do the right thing. And that's exactly why people are responding to your story, Sarah said, moving to sit across from him. In a world that often feels cold and uncaring, you showed that one person's kindness can make a real difference. That's powerful, Troy. As Troy pondered Sarah's words, his phone buzzed with a text from James. Troy, turn on Channel 7 now. You're not going to believe this. Curious, Troy flipped on the TV. To his shock, he saw Mr. Carlson, his former supervisor at Global Shipping, being interviewed outside the company's headquarters. Global Shipping has always valued efficiency and productivity, Mr. Carlson was saying, his face taut with discomfort. But recent events have forced us to reconsider our priorities. We are announcing a full review of our company policies, with a focus on promoting compassion and community engagement among our employees. Troy and Sarah exchanged stunned looks. This was unexpected, to say the least. The reporter pressed Mr. Carlson further. Does this mean you'll be reaching out to Troy Johnson, the employee who was fired for helping a disabled veteran? Mr. Carlson cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. We are considering all options at this time. No decisions have been made yet. As the interview ended, Troy's phone exploded with notifications. James was calling, along with several members of the veterans group. Even Melissa from his old job at Global Shipping was trying to reach him. What do you think this means? Sarah asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Troy shook his head, still processing what he'd just seen. I'm not sure. But whatever happens, we need to stay focused on the bigger picture. This isn't about me getting my job back. It's about changing the way companies think about their employees and their communities. Over the next few days, Troy found himself busier than ever. He agreed to a select few interviews, always steering the conversation away from his personal situation and towards the larger issues of compassion in the workplace and community engagement. During one particularly impactful interview on a national morning show, Troy emphasized his point. This isn't about one company or one incident. It's about creating a culture where kindness is valued as much as productivity, where helping others isn't seen as a distraction from work, but as an essential part of it. His words resonated with viewers across the country. Soon, stories began pouring in from employees at other companies, sharing their own experiences of being penalized for acts of kindness or going above and beyond for customers. The movement was growing, and Troy found himself, at its heart, a reluctant but passionate leader. He worked closely with James and the veterans group to organize community service events, bringing together employees from various local businesses to volunteer their time and skills. One Saturday morning, Troy stood in the community center, surrounded by a diverse group of volunteers. They were preparing care packages for local seniors and disabled residents, an idea that had grown out of Troy's experiences helping his neighbors during his unemployment. As Troy looked around the room, he saw faces both familiar and new. There was Melissa from Global Shipping, working alongside James and other veterans. Local business owners chatted with their employees as they packed boxes. Even a few local politicians had shown up, eager to be part of the positive change sweeping through the community. Troy, a voice called out. He turned to see Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor, making her way towards him with a bright smile. I just had to come down and see this for myself. You've started quite the movement, young man. Troy felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment. I didn't start anything, Mrs. Henderson. I just did what anyone would do. Mrs. Henderson patted his arm affectionately. That's where you're wrong, dear. Not everyone would do what you did. But because of you, more people are starting to. As Troy pondered her words, he noticed a commotion near the entrance. Turning, he saw a familiar face that made his heart skip a beat. Mr. Carlson had just walked in. The room fell silent as Mr. Carlson made his way towards Troy, his face a mask of discomfort and uncertainty. Troy steeled himself, unsure of what to expect. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Carlson said, his voice gruff but not unkind. I wonder if we might have a word in private? Troy nodded, leading Mr. Carlson to a quiet corner of the room. He could feel the eyes of everyone on them, the tension palpable in the air. Mr. Carlson cleared his throat, clearly struggling to find the right words. Mr. Johnson, Troy, I owe you an apology. Troy blinked in surprise. Of all the things he had expected Mr. Carlson to say, this wasn't one of them. Mr. Carlson continued, his words coming out in a rush. I was wrong. I was so focused on numbers and efficiency that I lost sight of what really matters. Your actions, your commitment to helping others, it's made me realize how short-sighted I've been. Troy listened in stunned silence as Mr. Carlson went on. The board of directors at Global Shipping has been in crisis mode ever since your story went viral. We've lost customers, our stock has taken a hit, and our employees' morale is at an all-time low. But more than that, we've lost our way as a company. Mr. Carlson took a deep breath before continuing. We want to make things right, Troy. Not just with you, but with all our employees in our community. We're implementing new policies to encourage community engagement and reward acts of kindness. And we'd like you to come back and help us reshape our company culture. Troy felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. This was more than he could have ever imagined. He looked around the room, at all the people who had come together because of his small act of kindness. Then he looked back at Mr. Carlson, seeing the genuine remorse and hope in the older man's eyes. Mr. Carlson, Troy began, his voice steady. I appreciate your apology and your offer. But this isn't just about me or Global Shipping anymore. It's about something much bigger. Mr. Carlson nodded, encouraging Troy to continue. I'll come back, Troy said, but on one condition. I don't want to just reshape Global Shipping's culture. I want to work with you to create a program that any company can implement. A framework for promoting compassion, community engagement, and ethical behavior in the workplace. If we can do that, then everything that's happened will have been worth it. Mr. Carlson's eyes widened as he considered Troy's words. For a moment, Troy feared he had asked for too much. But then, slowly, a smile spread across Mr. Carlson's face. You know, Johnson, he said, shaking his head in amazement, I think I'm finally beginning to understand why everyone speaks so highly of you. You're not just talking about changing a company. You're talking about changing the world. Troy felt a surge of hope. So, is that a yes? Mr. Carlson extended his hand. It's a yes. Let's do this, Troy. Let's show the business world that compassion and success can go hand in hand. As Troy shook Mr. Carlson's hand, a cheer erupted from the crowd that had gathered around them. The atmosphere in the room was electric, filled with a sense of possibility and hope. James made his way through the crowd, clapping Troy on the back. I knew you'd find a way to turn this into something even bigger, Troy. So, what's the next step? Troy looked around at the diverse group of people in the room. His former co-workers, the veterans, local business owners, and community members. An idea began to form in his mind. The next step, Troy said, his voice strong and clear, is to turn this movement into a lasting change. Mr. Carlson, I'd like to propose that we start by creating a community advisory board. We'll bring together employees, customers, and community members to help shape Global Shipping's policies and community engagement initiatives. Mr. Carlson nodded thoughtfully. That's an excellent idea, Troy. It will help us stay accountable and ensure we're truly serving our community. As Troy and Mr. Carlson began to discuss the details, the energy in the room was palpable. People started to gather around, offering ideas and suggestions. It was clear that this was just the beginning of something much larger. Over the next few months, Troy worked tirelessly to bring his vision to life. The Community Advisory Board became a reality, with James and several other veterans playing key roles. Global Shipping implemented new policies that encouraged employees to engage in community service, even offering paid time off for volunteering. But Troy didn't stop there. True to his word, he worked with Mr. Carlson and a team of experts to develop a comprehensive framework for corporate social responsibility and community engagement. They called it the Compassionate Corporation Initiative. The initiative outlined clear steps that any company could take to foster a culture of kindness and community involvement. It included guidelines for ethical decision-making, strategies for partnering with local nonprofits, and metrics for measuring the impact of corporate social responsibility efforts. As word of the initiative spread, other companies began to take notice. Troy found himself invited to speak at business conferences and corporate retreats, sharing his story and the lessons he'd learned. One crisp autumn morning, about a year after his fateful encounter with James in the Global Shipping parking lot, Troy stood on a stage in front of a packed auditorium. He was the keynote speaker at a national conference on corporate social responsibility, and as he looked out at the sea of faces, CEOs, HR directors, and business leaders from across the country, he felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. A little over a year ago, Troy began, his voice strong and clear, I was just a warehouse worker trying to do the right thing. I never imagined that helping a customer load some boxes into his car would lead to all of this. But that's the thing about kindness. You never know how far its ripples will spread. As Troy shared his story and the journey that had led to the Compassionate Corporation Initiative, he could see the impact his words were having. People were leaning forward in their seats, nodding along, some even wiping away tears. The business world has long operated under the assumption that profitability and compassion are mutually exclusive, Troy continued. But what we've discovered through this initiative is that they're actually deeply interconnected. When we prioritize kindness, when we truly engage with our communities, we create a positive cycle that benefits everyone: employees, customers, shareholders, and society as a whole. Troy went on to outline the key principles of the Compassionate Corporation Initiative, providing concrete examples of how companies had successfully implemented these ideas. He shared stories of increased employee satisfaction, improved customer loyalty, and even enhanced profitability. But more than any financial metric, Troy said, his voice filled with passion, what we're seeing is a fundamental shift in how these companies relate to their communities. They're no longer faceless entities focused solely on the bottom line. They're becoming integral parts of the social fabric, forces for positive change in the world. As Troy concluded his speech, the auditorium erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, giving him a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. As he made his way off the stage, Troy felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. In the lobby after the speech, Troy found himself surrounded by business leaders eager to learn more about the initiative. As he answered questions and exchanged contact information, he caught sight of a familiar face making its way through the crowd. "Troy," James called out, a broad smile on his face. "Man, that was something else. You had them eating out of the palm of your hand up there." Troy grinned, pulling James into a quick hug. "I'm just glad people seem to be taking it seriously. But what are you doing here? I thought you had a big order to fill this week." James shrugged. "And miss seeing my friend change the face of corporate America? Not a chance. Besides, business is booming these days. Turns out, being known as the guy who inspired the Compassionate Corporation Initiative is good for sales." As Troy and James chatted, a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit approached them. "Mr. Johnson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Hawthorne, CEO of Nationwide Dynamics. I was incredibly moved by your speech, and I'd love to discuss implementing your initiative at our company." Troy shook Mr. Hawthorne's hand, a sense of wonder washing over him. Nationwide Dynamics was one of the largest corporations in the country. If they adopted the initiative, it could lead to a seismic shift in corporate culture across the nation. "I'd be honored to work with you, Mr. Hawthorne," Troy said. "Perhaps we could set up a meeting next week to discuss the details?" As Mr. Hawthorne nodded enthusiastically and pulled out his phone to schedule the meeting, Troy caught James' eye. His friend was beaming with pride, and Troy felt a lump form in his throat as the magnitude of the moment hit him. Later that evening, as Troy sat in his hotel room, he found himself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past year. He thought about that day in the global shipping parking lot, about the moment he decided to help James despite knowing it might cost him his job. He never could have imagined where that simple act of kindness would lead. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Just saw your speech online. You were amazing, honey. We're all so proud of you." Attached to the message was a photo that made Troy's heart swell. It showed Sarah, their kids, and a group of their neighbors gathered around the TV, all wearing T-shirts with the Compassionate Corporation Initiative logo. Troy could see Mrs. Henderson in the front, her eyes shining with pride. As Troy stared at the photo, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. He'd set out to do the right thing, to stand up for kindness and compassion in a world that often seemed to value profit over people. And somehow, against all odds, that small act of defiance had blossomed into a movement that was changing lives across the country. Troy thought about all the people who had supported him along the way. Sarah, James, the veterans group, his former co-workers, and even Mr. Carlson. Each of them had played a crucial role in turning a moment of crisis into an opportunity for positive change. As he prepared for bed, Troy's mind was already racing with ideas for the meeting with Mr. Hawthorne. He knew there was still so much work to be done, so many more lives to touch. But for the first time in a long time, he felt truly optimistic about the future. Troy Johnson, once just a warehouse worker trying to do the right thing, had become a catalyst for change in the corporate world. His story was a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of standing up for one's values, and the profound impact that one person's kindness could have on the world. As he drifted off to sleep, Troy smiled to himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to spread the message of the Compassionate Corporation Initiative. And he was ready to face them all, armed with the knowledge that kindness, when nurtured and supported, had the power to transform not just individuals or companies, but entire communities and beyond. The story of Troy Johnson and the Compassionate Corporation Initiative was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. And as Troy closed his eyes, he knew that whatever came next, he would face it with the same courage, compassion, and conviction that had brought him this far. In the quiet of his hotel room, with the city lights twinkling outside his window, Troy whispered a quiet thank you to James, to Sarah, to everyone who had been part of this incredible journey. And he made a silent promise to himself and to all of them to keep pushing forward, to keep spreading kindness, and to never lose sight of the power of a simple act of compassion. Troy's journey of compassion and sacrifice led to an extraordinary transformation, not just for himself, but for his community and everyone who hears his story. His willingness to help someone in need, even at the cost of his own job, sparked a movement that changed more than just his life. It revealed the true power of kindness and standing up for what's right. If Troy's story resonated with you, be sure to subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. And before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think you would have handled the situation if you were in Troy's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below.